Hello and welcome to everybody to this conversation today about leadership, life lessons, boardroom dynamics, and probably a whole bunch of other subjects as well. I'm Jamie. I'm the executive chairman of a digital transformation specialist called Sea Learning, and I have the privilege of working with leaders all over the world who are doing extraordinary things. We tend to operate at the fringes where innovation happens, so I get to spend most of my days with extraordinary people who want to establish themselves as credibly at the forefront of what they're doing, so that's a real joy. I don't really feel like I've got a job. I'll introduce our special guest on this discussion in a few minutes. But before I do, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Chris. Do you want to introduce yourself, Chris?
Yeah, sure. Great to be coming along to this and getting involved with Graham this afternoon on this little podcast. Yeah, I'm product solutions manager for Sea Learning, so I like to get involved with people, find out what their sticking points are and snags, and just try and help and make their lives easier with tech or solutions that we support within the business. So really pleased to be on the call today. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And when he's not doing that, he's either playing bass guitar in a band, or he's riding his motorbike, or chopping up logs that he likes to do as a relaxing thing. And
nothing to do with the shirt.
And you're wearing a lumberjack shirt today, Chris, as well. So
soon to done here. I'm outside, cutting up wood.
So that brings me to our very special guest today, which is Mr. Graham Morley, an extraordinary person, as you're going to find out in the next 45 minutes or so during this conversation. Now, Graham has been a massive figure in my life, as we were just chatting offline before we started the broadcast. Been my boss for many years in education, been a principal. He's got decades of leadership at the highest levels, spanning several different sectors. And he's leading charitable organizations, most recently the Vice Lord Lieutenant of Staffordshire. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, which means you're the closest connection I've got to the King of England, Graham. And I just love how your career has spanned civic duty, community leadership, and you combine, so many things together. And you bring such a wealth of insight on what it means to lead, most importantly, in my world anyway, to lead with integrity and with a humility, and you inspire trust in others in very complex situations often. And maybe we're going to dig into that a little bit in the conversations today, because that's a very, very advanced set of skills and experience that you bring over decades, and I think it's a real privilege to have you in the conversation today. So thanks ever so much for joining us and spending a bit of time with us today in this chat. And this chat is not sponsored by anybody. It's not we're free to talk about anything. We're not talking about any particular products or services or anything like that. This is purely a conversation about leadership and boardroom dynamics and all the extraordinary insights that you've got over all the years that I've known you, and some of the wisdom you shared with me over the years as well. We were just chatting about that beforehand. I may weave that into some of the conversation today. Chris, for your benefit, and I'll phrase this slightly differently, but Graham once said in the boardroom to all of his directors, one of which was me, that just remember, in this boardroom, 80% of something is better than 100% of nothing. and I've never forgotten that, because it's true. Commit to action, do stuff, even if it doesn't go perfectly, at least you've done something, and any chief executive, as Graham knows, having been a chief executive for a number of years, that really matters. So that kind of brings me into opening question really for you, Graham, or opening discussion point rather. They're not questions as such, they're more discussion points. But looking back over all your experience in leadership, in education and wider, what's consistently remained true about what it means to lead well, in your opinion? And is there anything you think's changed particularly over the years in terms of what you think great leadership is?
Well, Jamie, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I'd like to start by saying thank you for making me feel so old. The way you explained decades of experience really pushed it there. And so I'd like to think I'm not that old, but I guess I am. When it comes to values, characteristics of good leadership, I think they've stayed constant throughout all of that immense period, as you pointed out. I think the context in which those characteristics, values, and attributes, if that's what they are exhibited, I think the context has changed massively. When asked about leadership, funny enough, it's something I get asked about quite a lot, and I'm not always quite humbled by it. I'm not sure why, but my my standard response is I don't have one. I don't have an approach to leadership, but I do think a lot about followership. Leaders aren't leaders unless they've got people following them. So what is it that makes people follow? And I do spend, and I've spent over the years, a lot of time thinking about that. I think there is two sorts of leadership when I've been, thinking about this little chat we're having now. And I think, and you've perhaps heard me say there's two kinds of leadership. There's two kinds of power, if you like, two kinds of tools that can help get things done. And one is the power that you get from being in the position of CEO. You're able to say, I want this done. You're paying people to at least pretend that they're going to do it, even if they don't do it. and so that is valuable, and I'm not saying it isn't, but there's something far greater than that, and that's the influence that you get as a leader from operating with integrity, with openness, fairness, genuineness, compassion, all of those things, minute by minute, literally, hour by hour, day by day, and that builds up a respect. And that respect leads to people wanting to do things for you.
Yeah.
And it's an odd thing about power, and both of those things are useful. Both of those things are useful, and shouldn't be underestimated. But the latter, in my experience, is far more valuable and far more useful. And the odd thing about power is that the more you give it away, the more you get, which is really odd. And that's connected with the second one, and that is about trusting people to do a good job, selecting the right people in the first place, explaining the framework clearly, and all of that stuff about tasks and objectives. And I think it's connected with that. And I am one of the few people I've come across that doesn't just talk about distributed leadership, but actually believe in it and do it. I think the changes, so all of that stayed constant, I think, throughout all of that period. And I probably got more skilled at it, if that doesn't sound too big-headed, as the years went on. But I started with a good dollop of that, if you like, to start off with, and maybe we'll get into that. But I think the changes, it's far more difficult now. I recognise that. It's far more difficult to be a leader now than when I started out in the 1990s as a leader. And I think that's partly down to digital communications. Do you know, I'm old enough to remember emails. I remember my first email. I remember the day when we used to have people going around with little slips of paper and all of that, and you used to get things through the post, and it had taken 3 days to arrive, and you had a couple of days to think about it, and then write your response, and another couple of days to get to the person, and that I never ever envisaged when I sent my first email in the 90s that it would become the bane of my life. And on top of that, we've had the explosion in social media. Yeah. And all of that instant communication that has led to instant, expectations of instant action and instant responses. That has, just developed into a bigger and bigger and bigger challenge. Yeah. And the other thing that has changed, and not a good thing, is the world's become a lot nastier than it used to be. Yeah. People used to be far more polite, far more forgiving, far more accepting of people's foibles and failures and not being perfect, where that's got considerably less, especially with the advent of what we all call keyboard warriors, who are able to sort of
100%.
Pull leaders in of all description, all sorts of organizations down. And I think that has developed into a development of political correctness, which is not helping. I was talking to a High Court judge. Name drop. I'm not name dropping. I'm not going to tell you who it is. Maybe position dropping. He was talking to me the other day. He said, even I'm worried about what I should and shouldn't say to somebody now. You know, when I'm talking to a woman or a person of a different race from the UK or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's High Court judge. You know.
Yeah.
Who's really concerned.
I think a lot of that is coming from the social media sort of explosion that we're talking about, because I see a lot of people now worried about their profiles, and if they say the wrong thing, because there'll be an army online suddenly shooting them down because they've said something that offended one person. And I'm trying to do my bit to keep it real on social media, which is why I share all the nonsense. Like, here I am falling off a mountain bike. I'm just a normal human being kind of thing. And I just think social media, I was once a real optimist about it. I had this Disney-like naive view of, isn't it amazing? We can all talk to each other all over the world. And I didn't quite anticipate the whole of the human race wanting to, destroy you for something.
And that's where I started. I went on that journey. I was really optimistic about the benefits, all this. I didn't really see all of the downsides that we now experience every day. And what worries me about this political correctness is that it will, my dad used to say, pendulums swing to an equal amount in both directions, and it will swing back, and that's not good either. No. And we're starting to see that swing back in some of the stuff we're seeing now on the other side of the pond. About have we gone too far when you describe somebody's sex in 70 odd different ways or something, whatever it is, and he's saying, no, it's now male and female, that's it. Now we all know it's more complex than that, but have we gone too far with 70 odd, is it, different descriptions of sexuality or whatever, and there will be a backlash, and that's what worries me, because that I think is coming. And it'll go back with a whole load more nastiness than.
I think there's a wonderful American comedian. I can't remember which one it was now, but I saw this American comedian doing this sketch about what he called selective outrage, and he was talking about how one of the downsides of social media is we now live in a generation, it seems, where people pick their selective outrage. But it sort of doesn't stand up to any logical scrutiny, if you apply a logical, rational behavior to it. But social media, of course, has encouraged that because of the way the algorithms work, and lots of other sort of negative things of that. So I think you're right. I think in many ways, I think a lot of people listening to this would probably be nodding about the fact that leadership in today's world is a bit more complicated than those of us who've been around for a few years. Like, I go back to when I started my career, and certainly technology is a lot more complicated now, and that sort of goes against one of my core beliefs, which is that technology should be simple to use and make your life better, and it has to do those two things, and yet so often it doesn't, does it? And so I think you're absolutely spot on with a lot of that.
I remember, Graham, the first place I worked at, you just mentioning there about your first sort of email and whatnot, and I saw a fax machine and I went, it's the holy grail. Technology will never move on from this. It's like, I've got a document that's come through a phone line, and it was like,
it's funny. It's funny you should mention a fax machine, right, Chris? Because as somebody who is one of the most successful Google salespeople in this country, which is what you are, with a sales hat on for a second. Speaking of fax machines, I've always wondered, like, I'd love to meet the salesperson who sold the first one, because it was useless. Like, who were you sending a fax to when you bought the first one? It's like, whoever that salesperson was did the most incredible job. Here's a machine. It's useless, but it's going to be useful in the future.
Everybody's got one. Yeah, that's right.
You gents do realise that we are now delving into a subject that at least half of your viewers
absolutely
have got no idea.
Yeah, they're googling. Oh, yeah. Graham, don't even get us started on this, right? So me and Chris, of course, now are veterans of the tech world, and half of our team is quite young, in some cases very young in this company.
Yeah, well, I remember a time you used to have to lick stamps. Can you believe that?
Well, you say stamps, half of our company would go, they'd Google it, they go, stamp? Oh, yeah. Stamp. Right, we were talking. What bands have we been talking about recently, Chris, with our team? Where with the young people in our team have gone, sorry, who?
Yeah, we went. Yeah, it was. We went to see Jamie and I were lucky enough to go and see Sting over at Cannock Chase about a week ago, and Subhan, one of our younger employees, went, you're talking about this sting. What is it exactly? Like it was a thing rather than a person? And then I went, he used to be in a band called the Police. Forget about it. You'll just get confused with the police force. You won't know what I'm talking about. And he, really hadn't got a clue. But I guess that's just definitely the generation gap, Jamie. We've definitely moved into the senior citizens role.
And but it works both ways, because they'll talk about going to see Biggie Small and Smalley Large, and we'll go, what?
I haven't got a clue who that is either. No, absolutely, yeah.
Anyway, Chris, I'll let you get back on track with your next discussion point, Chris. Over to you, my friend.
That's it. That comedian, by the way, is Chris Rock. So
Chris
the one
Rock,
with the selective outrage. Yeah. So there we go.
Okay.
Anyway, So Graham, you've obviously worked and chaired on many boards over the years. So just like sort of broadly speaking, and you may have covered this already in your previous conversation, what makes truly effective sort of board members and leaders, and is there any sort of common dysfunction that can throw that out? I know you've mentioned about sort of trust, and you've mentioned about giving people power. Can you sort of elaborate on that in any way from a board perspective?
Yeah, I've come across loads of dysfunction, but let's start on the positive. And what you want on a board is a broad and excellent executive skill set. Being able to see the bigger picture, being able to simulate information, and not necessarily data, but information, and independent thinking, and logical thinker, and that sort of stuff. I think it's really important, and I might get into trouble by saying this, is that there has to be, in my view, I certainly try to achieve that, a more or less equal mix of male and female. And I say that because what I've observed over the many decades that you referred to is that male and female have both got a logic, but it's very different. And if you take it back to its roots, if you would, that God created male and female probably for good reason, because we probably need both aspects in order to get to the right place. So I think that's quite important. I think, and it probably should go on from that to more diverse membership as well, so that the board is truly representative of the community that they're trying to serve. I think board members need to be skilled at constructive challenge, which is very different from being skilled at challenge. They need to be fully informed, and by that I mean truly informed. I don't mean told about stuff, given information that's buried in a tome this thick of paper, or buried into like the biggest spreadsheet you've ever seen. It isn't about data, it isn't about paper, it's about being informed about the key issues, so that they can then make informed judgments and all of that stuff. And boards should definitely be eyes on and hands off. Boards too often get too involved in management, and there is a very clear line between governance and leadership and management of an organization. And I built up a reputation over the years in more places than one. If you step over that line, you get pushed back, and it's down to a leader to make sure that the board members stay on the right side of that line. In terms of dysfunctions, obviously some or all of the above missing, and I have come across that. But I would say the most common dysfunction that I've experienced in organizations up and down this country is that board members are generally useless at challenging each other. They will challenge the senior team, they'll challenge the chief exec. They're quite comfortable with that, but almost always when I've heard a board member say something soft, and we all say something daft every now and again, we're human, it's not challenged by any other board members. And worse than that, occasionally, if the CEO diplomatically then says, well, can I just challenge on that and suggest that, other board members will then pile in behind the daft comment, like they need to protect each other because, you know, the way the board thinks has to be unified.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a real dysfunction when board members don't challenge each other, because it's actually, that's where the challenge should come from. It's a lot easier for board members to look at another board member and say, I can't believe you just said that, or why would you say that when there's this and this, or I disagree because of such and such, and get a proper conversation going about the issue. Rather, I've seen it develop into a course of action that could be catastrophic. Then the CEO has to go back and try and unpick it. You know, or at least deliver it in something that's half deliverable. Because
I mean,
groupthink, you know.
I've never been on a board as such, but I know, in fact, Jamie will say, any more questions other than Chris in most of our conversations, because if we've got a subject that we're covering, it might be a new piece of software, it might be something we're going to roll out, you'll get in any organization a lot of people just sitting there, you know, nodding their head, and then the meeting will finish and they'll come up to you afterwards and go, oh, I think that's a terrible idea, or why aren't we doing this? So I would much rather have people around me, and I'm sure you would, Graham, who've actually got an opinion rather than just yes men.
Absolutely.
You know, because,
you know, one of the sayings that probably Jamie's got written down there is, you know, that I would often say there's nothing worse than be surrounded by yes people, men and women.
I agree.
And the second worst thing is being surrounded by no people. You know?
I totally agree. The no people is definitely a problem. I remember listening to the chief executive of the chap who is credited with building the Eden project, and he was talking in a presentation about some of the mistakes he'd made with that, and his first team he assembled to build it was all the top architects, the top engineers, the top specialists he could find. And about 2 months into it, he realized it was all going horribly wrong, because all of them were coming up with thousands of reasons why this couldn't be done from a technical specialist point of view. So he scrapped all that, got a new team, and he said, I employed all these graduates. It was their first project they'd ever worked on. And somebody said, why'd you do that? And he said, because I needed to be surrounded by people who didn't know that it couldn't be done. Or to put it another way, people who had that can-do attitude of, let's do this. And also, just by way of feedback, because I've spent a lot of years in not that many years, just to be clear. In fact, hardly any years at all in the boardrooms of Graham, because he's just started his career, to be fair. Graham's just getting started. But let's make that point clear. But I've learned far too many things to cram into this time today we've got available. But just a couple of things I think Graham does that I would mention in this conversation for the benefit of anybody watching this or reading an article from this recording later, is that a skill you do lots of very small but very important things, in my opinion, Graham. And one of them is that in any board I've seen you in all the years we've known each other, you'll typically be the chair or the boss of it, and so very influential, of course, and could very easily guide that conversation in any given way you want. But you usually speak last on an agenda item, so something will come up, you'll introduce it, and you go around the table, and everyone on the table doesn't know what you think at that point. And I think that's a deliberate and very clever thing, because you get that collective wisdom, and then you sit there and you say, thank you. You're my top advisors. I've listened to what everybody said around the table. It's been a good conversation, a lot of diverse views, and here's where I think we've got to. And that is so clever if you think about it, because Chris, everyone on that table feels valued because Graham's listened. They've been able to say what they think. But ultimately, Graham's also done a very clever thing, because he's really got the proper wisdom and honest opinion of the people around that table, harness their collective wisdom, and then take an informed decision at the end. What do you think would happen if Graham spoke first and said, not
led the conversation? So, you know, Graham says, this is a great idea, everybody. And then, they feel challenged to then go, "Ooh, I don't know if it is great."
What would then happen is there'd be several people who might feel confident enough to stand up to the chair a bit and say, "Well, Graham, actually, I don't agree with you." But then the majority, I just think it would go a completely different way. But Graham is an exceptional chair and takes that in a particular way, which I think is a particular skill. And I think that shows a really detailed understanding of boardroom dynamics, which I think is incredibly effective, and it's just something I've seen you do, Graham. Either naturally or someone's coached you over the years that you've picked up. I mean, I don't know. Was that a learned thing, or did you just naturally sort of do that?
Well, I think the bit of that story, I mean, it's kind of you to say that, Jamie, but I think the bit of that story that, you sort of missed was that, remembering the times when I did speak first and everybody agreed with it, it was catastrophic, So, I mean, I think the worst thing a leader can ever do is think they're the smartest person in the room, It's because if you are, you've employed the wrong people.
Yeah.
As anybody who knows me knows I'm a massive fan of Formula One, and that led me to read a book by Jackie Stewart years ago. Jackie Stewart, for the younger generation, he was an amazing I think he was 7 times world champion in days when they had gear sticks and clutches, 3 pedals, and steering wheel and all of that stuff. And he then led racing teams, did all sorts of amazing things, and completely dyslexic, by the way. And he wrote a book about leadership and management. And in there, he said something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, never employ anybody who isn't smarter than you, because you can already do what you can do.
Yeah.
So employ people who are smarter than you. If they're not smarter than you, just employ them to do what you haven't got time to do. But that doesn't generally apply to people around boardroom tables. You need people around the table who can do the things you can't do. So why wouldn't you listen to them? Because they're actually better at it than you.
100%.
So that's
100%.
where that really comes from. And that comment that I read in that book, I mean, donkeys years ago, I've probably still got the book on the shelf here somewhere, but it's I never forgot it, because a lot of leaders I've witnessed do have to be the cleverest person in the room. They're challenged when they appear not to be. So I never tried to be, because I know I'm not.
Yeah, I totally echo that. I mean,
so that's where that listening. Yes, this is the issue. What do you think, guys? You're the experts. Tell me what I should do, and then listen and and learn.
100%. And I think if you get that right, that listening, which is a skill that I think you particularly have, Graham, in your leadership roles, you get almost a loyalty beyond reason with people. And that's something I see you have throughout your whole career. You have people who are loyal supporters of you, not because of any position of power you have over them. You get it through who you are.
I don't quite understand. I recognise that, and it's very humbling. And I'm not sure why I managed to generate that sort of loyalty. I'm incredibly glad I've got it.
I think it comes from characteristics. It's almost and I don't know whether great leaders are born or made, or a little bit of both, but I spend my life studying leadership, and I've been lucky to be surrounded by extraordinary people most of my career, and I think it comes down to, in many cases, to who you are. Like, for example, I often think of your leadership style in the same category as a good friend of mine who's in the RAF, and she's an extraordinary leader in the RAF. And I've said to her in the past, and this applies equally to you, in my opinion, but I've said to her, wow, I said, you're such an amazing leader, so inspirational, that you're one of those people who could get up in the morning with your troops and sort of say, right, who's up for codename Operation Certain Death? And everyone would go, yeah, and follow them. And that, of course, doesn't make any sense in one sense, because it's like, hang on a minute, codename Certain Death, But there are some people, some leaders who I think are so effective, they get that loyalty beyond reason, where people will follow them because they want to, because they align themselves with those people, not because they've got to, but because they choose to. And I think if you can get that right as a leader, which is quite a craft, then I think you're onto something special. But maybe we'll dig into that in more detail later on, because I'm conscious of time and I want to get through a few other discussions.
Yeah, I'm rabbiting too much, aren't I, Jamie?
No, it's me. No, well, we'll go on as long as we need to, but this is too valuable to miss. My next discussion point, really, before I hand back to Chris for the next one, is thinking of your role. Well, you've got lots of charitable roles in different ways, actually, but if I think specifically about the work you do as Vice Lord Lieutenant, engaging with people all over the Staffordshire and the West Midlands and the region that we live in, that's just one recent aspect of the sort of what I would call charitable work that you do, but you've always been a very, very values-driven person involved in helping an awful lot of people And I've seen that firsthand as well. I've seen you even at graduation ceremonies, and the sincerity and the authenticity that you bring to really caring about people. And that is quite something to see. I know that even back when you were chief executive of colleges and things, your colleagues around you would get quite emotional actually seeing how real that was and how authentic that was, seeing the boss sort of put all that time aside to help people in the way that you do. But what has all that sort of experience taught you about the nature and importance of community leadership in the complex, troubled world that we live in today? Sort of how important do you think that sort of civic connection is with leaders, and sort of that role that you do is? Because you do an awful lot in that space.
Well, I mean, you're too kind by far, Jamie. And I think, I don't want to sound conceited, but that civil connectivity has always been part of what I'm about, really. And so it's really hard for me to divorce my thinking away from something that I'm not. I've always sought to, partnership work with, other organisations in communities. And I suppose in some ways it's been easy for me because I've gravitated towards those kinds of environment, which give me an outlet to do something that I would want to do anyway. I would hate to be in politics, where I'm extremely interested in politics, because I want to make a difference, and I've always wanted to make a difference. And that's where that civic connectivity comes in, because you can make a difference. And so I guess that's why I didn't go into, things like manufacture or something like that, making widgets or whatever, where that, you can actually, not get that much involved with your communities and all the rest of it. So I find it's not an easy question to answer. What I would say, though, having reflected, now sort of finished, supposed to be retired. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it hasn't always been that easy. I think I've been misunderstood at times because of that civic connectivity. I think it's been detrimental to me and my organisation at times, because I've been doing things that I thought were for community good, and that was then misinterpreted, which then created a backlash which was different than and I think that what that taught me over the years is, don't expect everybody to think the same as you, and people often think the worst, or I created the FE college that you worked at out of 4 other colleges. And I'm not sure, even to this day, I might be wrong now, but I'm not sure that there's been a merger of 4 colleges. And that you come then with a reputation, which partly isn't fair, because how has he achieved this? You know what I mean? How has he got all of these other people to think, you know what I mean? And so it comes with fear, I guess. Awareness is perhaps a better word. So
on those themes, one of the things I learned from you is a couple of elements to the point you were just making there that I learned from you over the years as well that I think is relevant here, which is that you once said something along the lines of, again in the boardroom, this is going back a few years, but it was something along the lines of, if you do something, you did it for all the right reasons, then even if it goes wrong, you can defend that because you did it for all the right reasons. And conversely, never do something for which you cannot later defend. And as long as you cover those bases, even if it goes catastrophically wrong, at least you can say, well, hang on a minute, I did it for all the right reasons, and you can defend it. I think a lot of leaders get into a bit of hot water, and this might be a nice segue into Chris's next discussion point, actually, is I think a lot of leaders get into hot water when they don't take on those points that you taught me a long time ago, and which I've passed on many times to other people in different ways that I'm coaching people and stuff. But I think that's a good point. We might segue nicely into your next discussion point, actually. I don't want to steal your thunder, Chris, or your next discussion point about leaders who have to deal with a particular challenge or something.
Yeah, funnily enough, Graham, that last point about doing something for the right reasons was actually mentioned in a call we had earlier in the week, where we were doing a piece on Google not-for-profit and charity piece that we were in, and Jamie mentioned that that very statement. So yeah, okay. So just if we can just share a moment from your career, what would you say is the thing that's probably challenged you the most from a leadership perspective? Whether that's something that maybe you've pushed out there that hasn't worked or has had some kickback, and what did you learn from that about yourself and also the other people who were maybe involved in that process as well?
I remember right at the start of my so-called management leadership career, early 90s this was, and I'd got my first managerial position, and I'd made that the most difficult of, or was making that most difficult of transitions from colleague to manager. You know, you're working alongside people one day, you're the manager the next. That's probably the most difficult step anybody faces on their career into leadership, and most people have to do it. And looking back, I can smile, but it wasn't funny at the time. I perceived that in those days we used to have. I was a lecturer, and I loved being a lecturer, and although I say it myself, I was pretty good at it. But I had noticed that technicians, we used to have technicians in them days that used to help, you know, prepare lessons for lecturers like me and all the rest of it. And I don't think I was ever guilty of this, but I noticed that technicians were treated like second-class citizens by some of the lecturers, which I thought was appalling. And I'm not having any of this now. I'm a manager, and so I set out, you know, implementing a bit of a policy where technicians were sort of raised in importance. They were going to be listened to. They were going to be incorporated in meetings, and you know, all sorts of things. And I was absolutely astounded by the kickback that came from the technicians, because they were quite happy being, you know, I was going to say tret then, that's because I'm married to somebody from the northeast, but they like being, they liked it being second-class citizens in a way. They didn't want the responsibility. They wanted to go and do the job as they saw as a good job. They didn't want the authority. They didn't want the responsibility. You know, they were quite happy where they were. They didn't want some young upstart coming up and saying, no, now you're responsible for this, and look what, you know, how you can change the world and make things better. They didn't want to. They were happy where they were, and that was a massive learning thing for me. You know, I had to, you know, do one of them U-turn things that, you know, to get the press when PMs do them and stuff, but and sort of backtrack. And it made me think that just it's that thing I said a few minutes ago. Just because I think this way doesn't mean everybody's going to still think this way. And it's really important to try and work out the unintended consequences of any actions of what you're doing, especially when it comes to people, because people will not react the way you think they will nearly all of the time.
Yeah.
And so I did learn from that, and I never repeated that mistake, you know. And perhaps another one, I remember when I got my first big job as a CEO. I'd been, you know, CEO, principal and stuff, but I got the first really big one, £30 million organisation. And I'd got a board member who was a really good board member, actually. Very, very talented entrepreneur, made an absolute fortune in businesses and all of that sort of stuff. And he certainly didn't know the difference between leadership management or governance and leadership management. And he used to be, you know, giving, you know, my senior team a talking to and all the rest of it. And that was really uncomfortable because I respected him. You know, looking back, I was obviously a bit fearful of him as well. And I found it really, really difficult to deal with. But at that time, I'd got an executive coach and we talked this through about, you know, well, you know, okay, tell me about your organisation, Graham. How big is it? I said, well, 30 million. How many people do you employ? You know, 2,000 or whatever it was, you know. Well, who's the guy that's worrying you? I said, well, what's he done? Well, he's an entrepreneur. He's built this business. How big's the business? Well, 6 million. He's just sold it. 6 million. 6 million. How big's yours again? Okay, all right. And how many people did he employ? I think 20 odd people, I think. How many do you employ? Yeah, and it went through this conversation, and she made me realise, actually,
yeah,
there was no reason for me to be fearful of this guy. And so I decided to have a conversation one-to-one quietly, out of the way, not in a boardroom. I didn't want to create a scene or anything like that. And and so arranged to meet this guy, and I said, look, you're massively important to me. I respect you a great deal, but you can't do this. You are doing part of my job, and I'm not having it. And he didn't know what to say. He's like, oh, okay. And sort of left, and that was it. And I was sort of expecting this great big, explosion of, all of this stuff that I'd witnessed in other scenarios from him.
Yeah.
And he didn't do it. And, and 4 months later, he resigned and he was gone. And I think that taught me a massive lesson. And don't be frightened of standing up for what you know is right.
Yeah.
And the sooner you do it, the better, because it never gets easier. It only gets harder.
Absolutely.
And you back down, people like that do back down. Yeah. And then not long after that, he went bankrupt. So there you go.
Yeah. And, I've, on a similar note to that, I've spent like any leader has to deal with conflict, and you can spend a lot of time dealing with leaders having conflict with each other. And I've had various training and stuff over the years around the art of difficult conversations, as they call it, and things like that. But I see an awful lot of conflict also arise just from a simple misunderstanding of what one person perceives the other person as perceiving them as. So just what you might call a common misunderstanding, but neither talks to each other openly and honestly about it. So if you could just facilitate that sometimes, it's quite a revelation. I remember 2 of really high-flying executives that I had to broker a conversation with around this. And it basically, the end of the conversation was 2 people looking at each other going, well, I'm devastated. I had no idea I was making you feel that way. I feel terrible. I will make sure that doesn't happen again. And that was it. It was resolved. It's like, you sort of sometimes think, wow, you're dealing with senior executives, and even basic things like communication sometimes and perceptions can sometimes get misconstrued and lead to all manner of drama that shouldn't happen, really. But let's move us on. Let's move us on to the next discussion point. I'm interested in your take on this, Graham, because you spent a lot of time leading organizations that basically have no money. So if you're after a lot of money, you wouldn't choose charities or education. And you have spent a lot of time leading large organizations in those sectors. And one of the big challenges around those sectors where there's no money is often morale, engagement, enthusiasm, all the other things you want to bundle up in that sort of engagement package about how do you maintain momentum really in your organization. How do you get people to be motivated when you've got very limited resources, and people might be underpaid and things like that. What's your advice and guidance to people watching this who might be running a charity or an education institution, of which quite a lot of people will be in those sectors who watch this later or read about it later? What would you share with those people really about how you lead, how you drive engagement?
I think I'm minded to go back to now the 80s, which is even further back. And before I was in any management position whatsoever, and I wrote a piece that was basically, I can't remember exactly what the title was, but the piece was all about motivation doesn't come in a pay packet, and it doesn't. And I did believe that, and here we are. There so many years later, and I still believe that motivation doesn't come in there. So, all of those things are true, what you just said, but what can truly motivate individuals and groups of people and organizations is making a difference to others. That still motivates even in today's bizarre world, and if you can tap into that, how you can make a difference to the lives of other people, it's incredibly motivating, and what's more, rewarding to the individual, so that they can see the impact of what they are doing on on others who are probably less fortunate than themselves. And that typifies education, and it typifies a lot of charities, doesn't it? You know, charities are there to serve underrepresented groups, or groups that are having difficulty, usually financially, from, you know, for one reason or another. So you can tap into that. That's what will get people out of bed in the morning. It isn't what they're going to be paid or not going to be paid. You know, sometimes people ask me, you know, when you're having a pint or whatever, you know, why do you do this stuff? And I'll say, well, why wouldn't you want to? You know, and then start talking about some of the stories and the people that you've heard and seen, how, you know, they've started out from the neck end of nowhere and they've progressed, and you bump into them in some builders merchants, and they're running, you know, a big organization now, building houses or whatever, you know, or young people who are going on to have fantastic careers or doing fantastic things who just didn't believe that they could, or what. You know, if you're not fired up by that, in my world, you've got something missing, you know, and that, you know, and the world isn't even today all about money, and it's about tapping, being very clear about what it is you're trying to achieve. What is your vision for this group or this entity, whatever it is? Being very, very clear and talking about that vision, using words and phrases and mannerisms and stories which enable every individual within the organization to understand what they're working towards. You know, it's that old nastier story, isn't it, about the guy pushing the broom? Yeah. You know, we all know that one, so I won't repeat it, but that is really what it's all about, and finding the language that makes that work, and tapping into that and being honest. And if it's going to be really tough, tell people it's going to be really tough, because they'll work it out anyway. Yeah. And when you've worked it out, they'll only say, "Why didn't you tell us?" Yeah. You might as well be up front and tell them in the first place. You know, I've been in organisations where I've actually stood in front of hundreds of people and saying, "Look, you know, we're not in a good place. I've been brought in to try and sort this out." Yeah. And you know, because I've been here 2 days or whatever it is, you've been here for years, you know what state this organisation is, but I promise you, I will do my best. But most of you are going to lose your job. And get an applause for it. Yeah. Because that's what people want. They want to hear honesty. Yeah. And integrity and openness, you know. And I'll say, if you've got concerns, come and talk to me. Talk to me in the corridor. Talk to me over a cup of coffee, whatever. Yeah. And then 100%. Do that.
100%. Yeah, I agree with that.
So probably the closest I can get to an answer.
Yeah, it's a damn good answer. I was all when you were talking about integrity there. I love that old Woody Allen quote about integrity. If you can fake that, you've got it made. Anyway, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you for the next discussion point, and then I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to jump a few of. If we'd had longer, there's some of the wider discussion points, but I'm going to jump to the penultimate discussion point and let you have the final question as usual, Chris. But your turn next, Chris, I believe.
I always get the. I don't know why I keep picking the even numbers, Graham, because the final question's usually a right stinker. So Jamie always leaves me to that one. He's like, "Oh, thanks, Chris, for that one. Yeah, great." So he always gives that one to me. So yeah, just on that, you've touched there on some, you know, sort of honesty and being upfront and truthful and whatnot. So how have sort of your own values been shaped, do you think, by the people you've worked with, be that colleagues, students, trustee members, or the community over the years? And how have you managed to sort of stay grounded in those values over time? You come across to me, I've only met you today, Graham, but you seem like a very sort of down-to-earth and honest person within the work that you do. So I'd be interested to just hear your opinion on that, if that's okay.
I'd hate to be anything other than down to earth, you know.
Yeah.
It's hard to be supercilious when you started life as a bricklayer, you know. Let's be honest. You know? It's I was pretty good at bricklaying, by the way, but that's beside the point. I think my values were formed when I was a child. Actually, I didn't have the easiest of childhoods. You know, I was brought up in a very strict Christian household, which I kicked against as a teenager, a young person. But now you know, and for many years now, I look back on that as, you know, that's what provided me with my moral compass, that, you know, knowing that in really a good fix on what's right and wrong, and, you know, very little grey area. And I think I've had the privilege of working with some fantastic people over the years who have sort of reinforced that. So the values haven't changed. In a way, they've been reinforced, and I think that was down to, I didn't appreciate it at the time, and certainly not as a you know, we all go through that rebellious age, don't we, in the teenagers and stuff. Certainly didn't appreciate it then, but I massively do now, massively. And so, you know, I don't think my values have changed. I have had, I kind of tell you a story about many years ago. This would be the late 90s, I guess, maybe around the 2000 mark. I was working in a college, and I wasn't the principal. I was the head of a big faculty. That faculty in them days was probably bigger than some colleges are nowadays, but, you know, that's just what's happened to FE. But the principal sort of phoned me up one day and said, "Graham, I need you to go and listen to this talk at the local university." And I didn't want to go. So, you know, there's only so many excuses you can tell your boss who's that he's going to make sure you're going. You know, that it was one of those conversations. So I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll go." And because he wanted somebody to represent the organisation, and all I got to do was turn up, you know, have a cup of coffee and, you know, look half professional and sit and listen to this talk. And so I went, and this was before, you know, things like iPads. We had piles of paper and pencils in them days, and I thought, well, I'll take a whole load of work with me. You know, I'll write all these letters and do all of this adding up, and I'll sit at the back with a piece of paper and I'll just keep my head down, and, you know, I'll have done what the boss wanted. Nobody will bother. I'll be out of the way. And that's what I did. I went and sat at the back of this back of this university lecture room. There's lots of people there, and I just found a quiet corner. I was there working away, and this speaker was introduced, and the speaker was a guy called Frank Dick. And if I was to give anybody starting out on this journey, Google Frank Dick and listen and watch a video clip or whatever you can find, and they are on there. And he delivered this speech about mountain people and valley people, and he was introduced as somebody who'd worked in Formula One as a coach to the Ferrari Formula One team. And that got my head up, you know, straight away. And so I sort of rested my pencil, though I hadn't quite put it down at that point. And then I remember him, and it's probably not even politically correct anymore, but he came on stage, and his opening gambit was, well, you know, I'm sorry for having the most embarrassing name in the world, going through life with a name like Frank.
Brilliant.
Which made me smile. This guy, all of a sudden, I've lost interest now in this pile. I'm interested in this guy who worked in Formula One, amongst other things, who got a sense of humour, amongst other things. And he started talking about valley people. And now what they want to do is preserve their existence. They'll protect that. They'll work hard. They'll defend. They'll do all of that. And, you know, and I won't steal his thunder because he will do it far better than I. He talked about valley people. There's nothing wrong with valley people. You know, they're really good people. And their idea of winning is not losing. And all of this. And then he then started talking about mountain people. And mountain people live on mountains. And they want to look further and look over the horizon, and they are prepared to take risks to get to the next mountain, and all of this sort of stuff. And actually, do you know what? That talk changed my life. And I didn't want to go, but I never did a piece of work in that session at all. And then just about a year ago, I came across him on social media, and we had a exchange, and I thanked him for making a big difference. in my career, and we talked about what
Wow.
he'd done, and we exchanged pleasantries, and it was really nice. And he said
Wow.
some really nice things and stuff. But I love
that.
it was fantastic. It was a fantastic thing, and I was just in the right place because somebody else made me do it.
Yeah, you find that sometimes you just happen
Yeah.
to be through happenstance in the right where you need to be, sort of thing. And something happens that changes your life. So many things in my life have been like that, sort of what seemed like chance encounters with things, and have gone on to be profoundly impactful on the rest of my life in different ways. And it's funny how stuff like that works out, really. So I'm conscious of time, so we've got a couple more questions, and I'll bring us to a close. So I'm gonna skip a few discussion points for another day, but I'm gonna jump to next one from me before I hand back to Chris. Is you've worked obviously for a long time in and around education, and thinking about the complexities of the world we're in now, and you've alluded to this earlier with some of the points you made, Graham, about arguably how much more complex the world is now. Sort of what kind of qualities do you think that you would suggest that you think are important from a leadership point of view for this complex world we're in now, whether it's education or anywhere wider, really, because you've got experience of multiple sectors. But what do you think are the qualities for leaders coming through now in this world we're in now? What would you recommend are very important qualities to have? Let's put it that way.
I think the qualities, the characteristics haven't changed. And I'm not saying that because I'm one of those people who think it was better in my day, and I'm resistant to change because I'm not. But I think those, the qualities that attract followership haven't changed very much. The context has, the expectations have, the tools have changed massively. And when I see young people now, I'm really confident about the future. I'm fortunate to still work with, members of senior teams who are working through their careers, and they've grown up with different life experiences than I had. Many of them have grown up since 9/11. In a world that I think changed yesterday with 9/11. It wasn't yesterday; it was years ago. And they bring a whole different set of life skills that I probably wouldn't be successful in, given the skill set I had. If I was starting out with that skill set then, now I wouldn't succeed. You need the life skills that you've lived today. And I'm really confident you do need all of those, the empathy and, and all of that stuff that we've talked a little bit about. I think that hasn't changed. The context, but then the life experiences that people are bringing have changed, and most of them don't appreciate the amount of skills they've already got. And so I'm really, really confident that the future's in good hands when it comes to leadership.
That's awesome.
There'll always be clowns around, won't there?
And speaking of which, Chris, I'm going to ask you to.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for setting me up with that, Graham. It's probably quite an easy question. It's probably the shortest question of the day, so I'm going to drag it out and make it the longest. But it's not overly complicated. Just very simply, your favourite or a quote that has stuck with you, and how that's influenced or changed. You mentioned there about Frank and his particular talk and whatnot. Is there any sort of quote or anything like that you go, that's the way to live, or that's the way to try and do business, or that's the way to try and live my life in general? What would you say is the one in particular?
Well, I think Jamie's already referred to the fact that I've got a bit of a reputation for coming out with one-liners, so I'm not going to just answer that with just one quote, am I? And I think when the way you just asked your question, if I ask you, what's your favourite food today, it's going to be very different than what's your favourite food last year and what's your favourite food next year. At the moment, tonight, I don't think I fancy a bag of chips. That might be my favourite thing to have tomorrow. So I think quotes are a bit like that, aren't they? But one guy I worked closely with for a number of years used to work in the RAF, funny enough, and he ended up teaching military strategy at Sandhurst. He used to say, no strategy survives first. What was it? No strategy survives first contact with the enemy. Tyson, the boxer, put it a different way. Everybody has a strategy until they're smacked in the gob, I think he said. And I think you need to remember that as a leader. When you're sitting there sort of working out your project and how you're going to implement it and all of that, and too often we'll think, and that'll sort it, and that just doesn't happen. I'm not saying everything we do should be treated like an enemy, because it shouldn't, but it's things don't, these strategies don't survive when they get out there in the wide world, and we need to sort of remember that. And then when I was young, I don't know if you remember or have heard of a guy called Terry Waite, who was imprisoned in the Middle East for
absolutely
like 3 years. He was an envoy for the Archbishop of Canterbury, if I remember. And I remember watching this on the news. And he wrote a book, and I watched him on a documentary on television, and he talked about harmony isn't when everybody in the room is saying the same thing. Harmony happens when everybody in the room is saying a different thing, but it actually comes together. And I think, going back to something you said earlier, Jamie, I think that's what I tried to do. I tried to listen to the different voices, the different approaches, and give space for those discussions to enable harmony to emerge. And that's what we all like in music, listening to Sting or whoever. It isn't everybody doing the bass line. It isn't everybody doing the drums. It's all of that stuff coming together. And that's and harmony.
That is a pretty awesome way to end this conversation. If you'd asked me, Chris, for a quote I can relate to, I'd refer to that great philosopher Homer Simpson, who once said, "One day somebody will call me sir without adding you're making a scene."
We are still waiting for that day with Jamie. Yeah, we're still waiting for that day with Jamie.
But before I bring it to a close, I will end with another quote, actually, which I just had in my mind, like listening to so many of the points you've generously shared in this conversation, Graham. And it's a quote that one of my mentors, who's sadly no longer with us, recently passed away. But he passed on this quote, which is not his words, but words I hadn't heard before he told me about them. And he shared it with me when he'd lost one of his close friends, which is quite a well-known figure, Sir Ken Robinson. And he said this quote, which goes something like, "What we do for ourselves dies with us, but what we do for others lives on." And going back to how you started this conversation, Graham, with some of the points that you've shared, the common thing in everything that you've done is that very quote. You haven't done things for yourself. You spent everything in your career in roles that are all about other people and transforming the lives of other people in so many ways. And I can't personally think of a better way to spend your life than that. And I think that's quite inspirational. And I'm deeply grateful to you giving up some of your personal time to do this today. I'm thrilled to, when we get this edited and whatever, I'll be thrilled to share this out with the wider world, because there'll be a lot of younger leaders just starting off, maybe in some cases their careers. And I've long believed in the power of absorbing wisdom from others, because everybody knows something you don't, as they say. And you've been really generous in sharing some absolute nuggets of gold today with our audience. So I'm going to stop the recording now, but just to say, on behalf of all of us, Chris and myself and everybody else involved, huge thank you to you, the boss, Mr. Graham Morley. Thank you very, very much.
Well, don't switch off just yet, but I just want to say it's been a tremendous privilege just to sit and chat to you guys. You've been too kind by half, Jamie. So what I would advise all of you listeners to, take whatever Jamie says about me with a massive dollop of salt. And if I've helped in any way, that's great, but don't forget, you need to be having fun doing this as well.
Absolutely. 100%.
I wish everybody who's watching the best of luck with this, and thank you to you guys for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.